Hello and welcome everyone. This is FUC. We are a weekly online series that hosts conversations around labor, labor movements, decommodified knowledge, and critically the future of the university and higher education. Our series is facilitated by rent-burdened graduate students at the University of California. And importantly, we are in solidarity with the COLA movement, which is the cost of living adjustment movement. For more information about our series, to see recordings of our previous talks, please visit our website and contact us at colaorparish@gmail.com. And Tom, my co-facilitator, should be dropping those links into the chat shortly. Okay, so I am Molly Thrailkill. I am a graduate student in visual studies at Irvine. My co-facilitator, Thomas Williams, is a graduate student in English there as well. As facilitators, Tom and I are here to provide our energy, our resources to grow this platform, to make a space for these conversations and the vital discussions that take place here. Importantly, we are really here to listen and to learn alongside you all and to amplify the voices and the struggles of our colleagues. So a couple of sort of important points to that. First, if you are not already aware of or a signatory of the UC boycott, this boycott is a call of conscience to not speak at any University of California campuses until the administration reinstates the 41 UC Santa Cruz graduate students who were fired for strike activities, and they are now ineligible for fall positions. The boycott signatories will not give guest lectures or provide public speeches, either remotely or in person, at the UC. We are going to be hosting a special panel discussion with UC boycott signatories on August 7th, and Tom and I can say a little bit more about that at the end of today's event. The second thing that we would like to promote today is the UC Santa Cruz Wildcat Strike Fund. The sort of funds there have largely been spent, and there are still 41 workers who have yet to be reinstated. So if you have the means, please do donate if you can. And before we kind of move to our talk today, one last sort of note from me is that for our Q&A, if you have a question for our speaker, please drop Thomas Williams, a note in the Zoom chat to be added to Stack. And importantly, let him know if you would like to be unmuted and to sort of speak your question out loud to the group, or if you would like for us to sort of read it on your behalf. Okay, so today we are very excited to welcome Ebenezer Fitch Professor of Humanities at Williams College, Joy James.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks, Tom. So today I want to talk about the algorithms of anti-racism, but definitely with, center in my mind about how we can work in coalition and including coalition for the graduate students, right? Who have been on strike and who've been punished for speaking up for their rights, and also for the need for COLA across the board. And also in a way how anti-racism as an algorithm can be shaped in dominant platforms that don't necessarily work for working class people, laboring people, or for radicals themselves. And I understand that the term radical revolutionary is pretty fungible and moves around, but maybe we could explore that. And one way I wanted to explore it was to start with a clip from the Chicago Teachers Union that they sent out last December on the 50th anniversary of the COINTEL assassination of Fred Hampton, along with Mark Clark. It was a joint endeavor between the Chicago Police Department and the FBI in order to stop revolutionary struggle. And I want to think of this not just as an algorithm, but maybe as a possibility of linkages and alliances from unions to revolutionary struggle itself, despite the precarity and cost. So thanks, Molly or Tom, if you could upload that.
This depends on the education. Well, the whole thing.
No, but in the end, this does. You can form this with no education. You can form this.
No, not the way we talking about forming it. Right. We talking about forming it right. It's not on the paper. We didn't write it on the paper.
Form it right with no education.
No.
Let me give you an example. Jomo Kenyatta formed the excellent revolution with no education. And then at the end thing, Jomo told the motherfucker, I said, well, you can educate hate the enemy, but I'm your brother. I'll help you lead the revolution. Now I'm more pressure. Another example, Papa Doc in Haiti. Papa Doc in Haiti hated everything white. Man, you couldn't put this white paper in front of Papa Doc's face, but he moved all the white people out and he took over and be the president. He did, causing no education. And the people that had been educated, they just said that we don't hate the motherfucking white people, we hate the oppressor, whether he be white, black, brown, or yellow. So we got to know the educational program to find out what is going to be in the finale. A lot of people, Jomo Kenyatta is called not a never a revolutionary, but an ex-revolutionary. So it's Papa Doc. They brought on a successful revolution. That thing in the Miles was a bitch. Bantu freedom fighters, all that kind of action. What we're saying is the end. But you don't judge Castro now. You can't do it. Nobody in this room could judge whether Castro's going to be a revolutionary or not. You know what I mean? We're talking about things, you know what I mean, with China, the People's Republic, and even at the stage they're in now, talking about even going on further into a communistic state. That's what we're talking about. Those are revolutionary. So we got to understand here the educational program that you have to be able to figure out whether it will go on the right lines where the people will end up in a situation where they can be able to really control themselves. You understand what I'm saying? With no education, the people take this local foundation and start stealing money because they won't be really educated to why it's the people's thing anyway. You understand what I'm saying? With no education, you have neo-colonialism instead of colonialism, like you got in Africa now, like you got in Haiti. So what we're talking about is there has to be an educational program. That's very important. As a matter of fact, it's so important for us that a person has to go through 6 weeks of our political education before he can consider himself a member of the party, able to even run down ideology for the party. Why? Because if they don't have an education, then they're nowhere. You dig what I'm saying? They're nowhere because they don't even know why they're doing what they're doing. You might get people caught up in the emotionalist movement. You understand me? You might get them caught up in because they're poor and they want something. And then if they're not educated, they want more. And before you know it, they'll be capitalists. And before you know it, we have Negro imperialists.
Okay, so this talk is really a conversation. I hope it, it's more of a dialogue than, talking head. And it started when I was listening to the radio and I heard Color of Change talk about their boycott of Facebook, which was joined by NAACP, nonprofit corporations, but also by corporations. And the argument, and what rightly so, was that Facebook was structured around algorithms that promoted white supremacy, misogynism, transphobia, sexism, misogynoir, and this mobilization, right, to change the algorithm, to have surveillance that was going to work to clear white supremacies off the platform, to minimize the harm done to users and consumers was really striking. And so when I was listening to this discussion, I was wondering if there was an algorithm for anti-racism. And this is pretty much where this conversation, I hope it's a conversation, right? But this exploration starts, right? And I know we've been having the hearings now of the big four. So it's Google, it's Apple, Amazon, and Facebook, right? Before the congressional. And it's a lot about antitrust. Can you bust them up? And it's also the way in which billionaire corporations usurp the powers of the public or the citizenry. But I'm wondering if on our best days, we're also disciplined to certain algorithms that as we move from, and I'm not talking about me and the individual, so we in the collective, we've moved in these movements from wanting to be not just non-racist, like don't call me that, I'm a good person, to anti-racist, meaning that we want to mobilize and struggle. But if there's in fact an algorithm that predates this mobilization, that structures our very interventions. And if that's the case, then I'm wondering if we could explore that and I could learn more about how to critique and also how my own mobilization or my own organizing or solidarity becomes more effective. So I want to talk about the dominant algorithm for anti-racism as something that prefigures the definition and function of abolitionism, to the extent that it meets a basic level of opposition to racism, but it also has the capacity to siphon off revolutionary possibilities. And again, these terms, what is revolutionary, what is radical, what is liberal, they need to be unpacked more, and hopefully in the discussion we can do so. So I'm gonna argue that revolution is a singular, elusive phenomenon that, I wrote freaks out, but anyway, that disturbs or terrifies a number of people, even the people who want change, right? Because of its capacity to destabilize prevailing norms and structures. And part of an algorithm is to structure. And again, like full disclaimer, I have no tech background. I'm using an algorithm in the sense that like a recipe, you have a recipe for brownies or kombucha, you just follow the instructions and then you're supposed to have something that's edible or drinkable, right? So my argument is that there's a dominant algorithm for anti-racism. If you follow that, you're supposed to have tangible political progress. And I'm just trying to interrogate that as maybe it works sometimes and maybe it doesn't. So the abolition that we've inherited historically in the United States was not designed as a vehicle for revolutionary struggle. It was a remedy for cross accumulation and racial war. So we're talking about enslavement. And to keep in mind, right, because so much of this narrative is fixed on people of African descent, but indigenous people were enslaved as well. And so conquest, which I've written elsewhere, can be understood as war, just as enslavement can be understood as war. And if you think also about police violence or police homicides of unarmed individuals, it's, yes, Black people disproportionately are killed, but I believe that indigenous people are killed at the same rates, if not higher. So the established abolition was not established for revolutionary struggle. And I want to pick this up by looking at 18th century abolitionism, referring to Vincent Brown. He's a historian. His most recent book is called Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic slave war. And he's talking about the 1760, 1761 war in Jamaica. And the British had accumulated most of their wealth from this colony. And of course that colony was built on the backs of slaves. So this is a quote from Tacky's Revolt. Slaveholders cited Black militancy as a justification for their brutality. In response, late 18th century abolitionists would rally around the image of a kneeling supplicant begging to be recognized as a man and a brother, as if the condemnation of evil required the meek innocence of its victims. That icon of abjection has shaped the prevailing understanding of bondage and race to this day. So I'm arguing that from the 18th century, right, the push against white supremacists has needed to have this figure of the suffering Black, which, you know, rightly so, slavery is a zone of suffering, but it's also a zone of rebellion. And so in order to erase the militancy, to make Blacks more embraceable by, you know, what I'll call hegemonic progressives, right, that our suffering almost forecloses the possibility of our rebellions. And so our rebellions look more like protests than they look like organized insurrections. And this I've talked about before when I talk about the erasing of COINTELPRO, the sidelining of political prisoners who fought in underground formations. Decades past, some of them are still incarcerated, doing their 49th year in prison. That the way in which we talk about abolitionism is predicated on a mass Black whose very agency recedes as their suffering becomes, you know, comes to the forefront and becomes a signature of what are the possibilities of Black humanity and reconciliation under this democracy. So under this historical abolitionism, right, people might forget that 200,000 Black Americans fought in the Civil War. Some would argue that is why the North won. They might also forget that before the Civil War, John Brown was not the only person at Harper's Ferry with his sons. There are also Black insurrectionists, and AAIHS, the African American Intellectual History Society, next month, which is August, known as Black August, right? They're having a whole series discussions with Stevie Wilson, who's been incarcerated for a number of years, and academics talking about abolitionism in its more radical forms, right? So that at Harper's Ferry, what you have is when the state prevails, when it suppresses the rebellion, right? You have John Brown's body returned to New York for a ceremonial burial, but the Black men who fought alongside him, that they're either killed in skirmishes in the street, and then their body parts, like lynchings, are taken as memorabilia for the victors, you know, meaning the white citizenry, and we don't have to air quote citizenry because that was citizenry, or they were donated to the local medical college for experimentation, right? So the very fact that you have Black rebellion disappears into a medical lab, you know, at a medical school, right? Or disappears into like a pickling jar on somebody's trophy case, right? So the heroism, and I'm not, you know, celebrating rebellion as if that's the only way to struggle, but the notion of agency resides in one sector and it disappears in the other. So even the debates around the monuments, when you get to Lincoln and his monument, the memorial, sorry, New York's in a heat wave right now. You have this kneeling Black person modeled on a real African-American who fought for his freedom, who, you know, in real life is fully clothed, you know, is articulate, litigated for freedom, fought for freedom, et cetera, but you have, you know, a kneeling supplicant looking up at a great white savior. So to the extent that our algorithm is shaped for that, a Black dependency on white agency that is heroic, that becomes an impediment to understanding the full history of political struggle and also the ways in which coalitions could unfold in more fruitful manners. So I want to go through and note a couple, it's like a checklist of things that I've noted like in this algorithm. And my experience is based like in part on being an academic for decades, but before I became an academic, I was an activist, right? And so organizing with folks, and so like a little sidebar, I was introduced to abolitionism by Angela Davis when I was their postdoc at UC Santa Cruz decades ago. But I had met Davis before that when we were organizing, you know, me as a grunt, you know, kind of disciplined, you know, young grad student, just follow orders organizing, which was fine. But meeting in these different sectors, right? New York City, Nairobi, Moscow, Montgomery, Alabama, which were totally different from the academy. And for me, that kind of organizing, I could do for hours without feeling depleted emotionally, intellectually, politically, because it wasn't structured inside the academy. It was structured with working class people, and I'm talking about other organizing. It was organizing against the NYPD in the streets. It was organizing in other countries, in cities that I mentioned, sometimes independent of these organizations, women organizations where I met Davis. It was organizing, meeting people who were fighting the Contras in Latin America and meeting people who had survived different kinds of attacks, or going to Cuba and meeting people who had been given safe haven by Castro. So that is where the algorithms break down as dominant structures to channel political thinking and analysis, is in real time organizing outside of structures. But decades later, as an academic who has been disciplined by academic ethos and culture and blah, 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 and then under COVID, and also having lived in still living in what was an epicenter, New York City, where we went from 20 to 30 people dying in their apartments a day to 200 plus dying a day. And so hearing ambulance sirens all day and all night, and then they just stopped giving us the numbers, right? But this sense of like being dependent now on interaction through visual learning, through webinars like we're doing now, right? Made me pay more attention to algorithms because I was watching all these virtual educationals on anti-racism. And they all seem to say the same thing. It just seemed to be that the logic, the discourse was very stable, and these wild card kind of interventions that you would see more in an Erica Garner, who took on a city mayor, a governor, and Obama himself, that those things were erased from the algorithm. So I'll go through my checklist now after I give you that sidebar of why I even became, interested in this discourse. So the algorithm here, there's about 6 or 7 notations in the recipe. The algorithm elevates pervasive Black suffering over the inevitability of Black militancy that we should plan for. And I believe that rebellions trigger surplus police violence. And we're seeing it, I think a lot of attention is focused on Portland now, in part because it's predominantly white and appears to be white middle class. And so the violence that happens against whites registers more as a shock about the democracy, where the violence against Black or Indigenous people or undocumented people just is normative to it, right? But this is one of the things about, that I've noted, that I've listed, and I don't want to eat up all the time, so I'm gonna go to the next one. We can talk more about these notations or steps in what I'm calling the recipe of a certain algorithm. The other thing is the algorithm cloaks liberal hegemony and investment portfolios. So Archie Mafije, he's a late African theorist, wrote in an article in the 1990s titled White Liberals and Black Nationalists, and subtitled Strange Bedfellows. He argues that a general hegemony is, quote, opposed to any real change in power relations, end quote, because although powerful progressives are, again, I'm quoting him, prepared to be ruled by somebody else, they reserve the right to reign, right? So he makes this fine differentiation, which I think is really it's fascinating, about, and I voted for Obama in 2008. Like the corporate elites, I know that sounds like a cliche, didn't really have a problem with Obama. In fact, I think he broke the record in terms of corporate donors. So a Black face in high office, and I know there's this whole discussion now about which Black woman, or will it be Elizabeth Warren or one of the governors from New Mexico or elsewhere in Michigan. But the whole necessity about a Black woman as VP, right, doesn't really change the direction of hegemony, right? I mean, it's okay to have this diversity of faces, but if the hegemony actually decides that it maintains the definition of power relations and the definition of political terminology, hence what I'm arguing is that, a liberal hegemony wrote the algorithm of anti-racism that we all use almost as a default metric, right? And that the language we use about struggle is largely written by liberals, even if we call it radical in most of our interactions. If, as Mafije says, if general hegemony is not directed towards Indigenous people, it's not directed towards Black people, working class people, laboring people, then nothing fundamentally has changed. And I would argue that those who have spent millions of dollars to fund platforms and popularize terminology and concepts for political struggle do not inherently share power. They invite you to join their platforms, but they don't invite you to redesign them, right? So I'm going to move on to the next one. The algorithm mystifies state repression and wars against dissidents. So we opened with the clip from Fred for a reason, of all the brilliant theorists, right? And he never wrote a book. But if you listen to his speeches, it's both audio, you can read them, but it's the audio of them. When you find the clips where he's talking to people, when he talks about Rainbow Coalition, white power to white people. I mean, the first time I heard white power to white people, I was like, wait, stop. Because I grew up in Texas, right? And then that's all I need to say. So like white power to white people, brown power to brown people, red power to red people, yellow power to yellow people, Black power to Black people, all power to the people, none to the police or to petty bourgeois politicians. It makes you rethink struggle, and it doesn't come off and I don't have the language to quite explain, because what I'm saying is it registers on an emotional intelligence level, not just on a political analytical level. And so to verbalize emotional intelligence is maybe not my forte. But anyway, it comes off as a puzzlement. Like, it comes off as something that you have to unpack about who you will trust. And particularly in that clip when he's talking about Papa Duck, and he's saying you can end up with a Black imperialist, right? And if you think about it, I'm not here to bash Obama, or why I need to say that, I don't know. But anyway, so Obama was your first Black imperial president. And given, yes, the US is being challenged by China and other sectors and obviously falling into decay, but Obama's job, he kept telling you, I'm not your first Black, like I'm the president of all the United States, et cetera. But also he was gonna follow capital, and he was gonna follow a foreign policy that stabilized, right, American hegemony or control over markets, but also over certain types of violence. And this mystification of state repression is demystified by Fred and others, but their narratives are not structured into the dominant algorithm. So I found it fascinating that the Chicago Teachers Union, who were on strike at the time, I believe, and who were striking to get police officers out of the schools, and who were also dealing with the fact, again, that if you think that having a Black woman or Black feminist or a person of color, indigenous, like just the markers mean transformation, but they were struggling with Lori Lightfoot as mayor, right? Who recently stated that she wasn't gonna cut the Chicago police forces because that was a vehicle for Black and brown people to make it into the middle class, right? And so it would be a form of, quote, racism if you defunded the police in Chicago. So this is the way in which I see Fred's intervention and others, but their interventions always seem to be sidelined. But the Chicago teachers pick it up, they elevate it, they tweet it on the anniversary, and also following their successful strike to get, you know, cops out of schools in Chicago. I'm going to move on past this. I think we're familiar a little bit about Fred's assassination and the kind of chaos and also trauma that unfolds when our struggles are met with violence. And I want to go to another sequence in this, which now hopefully we debate this, is the possibility that algorithm fosters brood parasitism. So a brood parasite, right, is some bird that's laying their eggs in your nest, and they disguise them to look like they're your eggs, and so you're hatching their stuff, right? So if you think about it just on the level of politician, both a Black woman politician, mayor in DC, and a white mayor in New York City who has a Black family, that painting Black Lives Matter on the avenues respectively to the White House or to Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan is a form of brood parasites, right? Or brood parasitism, right? And so one way to redo that or to reimagine, and I'm still cautious about this language of freedom dreams and imagination. I'm not opposed to it. I'm still just trying to figure it out and where it fits on the algorithm, the dominant algorithm, is like if BLM meant not Black Lives Matter, but Black liberation, or Black liberation movement. So BLM becomes Black liberation movement, and that sort of ends the whole notion of any brood parasites coming into your nest, because mayors are not going to paint Black liberation movement on Fifth Avenue or on the streets that leading to the White House, because you've moved from like a catch-all phrase to something that has a specific agenda. Is it totally clear what a Black liberation movement is? No, but if you actually call for one, I believe that you start to see a realignment of coalition and different political forces. The next one, and then I mentioned like we could talk more about political prisoners in that section. This next one is a little complicated. So I want to talk about Black feminist leadership. So there is in the discourse that I was listening to, a lot of times, I was gravitated always towards multi-racial discussants, right? And it seems everybody knew that. Like, you couldn't do an all-white panel, you couldn't do an all-male panel. There had to be gender, race, sexuality, all these different identities had to be present for a discussion to have any kind of legitimacy. But I would caution this construct that Black feminists or Black women are inherently heirs to political rebellions, right? Just having looked at political rebellions over decades, having family, adopted family, kin, whatever, who actually fought in them or ended up in prison because of them. The way in which gender is being discussed right now seems to skew more towards bourgeois constructs, or I would even say a form of state feminism, which I would link with Gloria Steinem, and I've written a little bit about that in terms of her capacity to fund a lot of different projects, not just only in the US, but also around the world. And so some of the cautions I would say when I hear people say, if we only have Black feminist leadership, I would appreciate if they also included, even though I'm sure they said, well, of course we don't mean that kind, but yeah, I would say Condoleezza Rice is an example of Black feminist leadership. It's just like, she also helped market, a catastrophe known as an invasion of Iraq under false pretenses of weapons of, mass destruction held by Saddam Hussein. And so those weapons were not there, but you destabilize the Middle East, you create hundreds of thousands of casualties, and then you can still appear behind Brett Kavanaugh and actually introduce him, for his seat on the Supreme Court. So unless we differentiate not just about Republicans, but also Susan Rice, who worked in the Obama administration, but according to foreign policy, helped to nix, when she was working with the Clinton administration, any response from the UN against the genocide in Rwanda, because they didn't want to label it a genocide. So I think there's some complexities here around class issues and ideology that may be under scrutinized in terms of these constructs of a Black feminist hegemony replacing the white liberal hegemony that Mafije talks about. So moving on and moving towards the close, the algorithm's mark of restorative justice, if it constructs all prisoners as political prisoners, is diminishing the agency of people who are incarcerated because they engage in political acts as opponents against the state. And I'll keep this one brief, but you can note with the unmarked vans and what the NYPD is doing and what the federal forces are doing, what BAR is doing, they're gearing up for another ramping or increasing capacity to detain and imprison new cadres of what I would define as political prisoners who fought. So these are not people who are in prison because they were poor or Black or undocumented. These are people who were in prison because they fought against the state or police forces. And so they will face surplus violence because of opposition. So moving towards the close, I think that there's incredible work that is being done by a number of sectors. My question that I've raised here is that if there's a shared language that we're all using and it implies a shared analysis, if in fact it curtails certain kind of radical or revolutionary possibilities, and that dreaming about them is great, but people have actually enacted these particular struggles that tend to be minimized. And my last thing I would just say in closure is that maybe the possibility that our starting point and our end point is, what do children need, right? And that, I think, changes the whole equation. I mean, that becomes revolutionary. So for Black people, I believe our suicide rate among Black children has gone up 93%. and there are reasons for that, obviously, tied to the state, but also tied to violence and trauma, intergenerational violence, police violence, and intergenerational trauma. And I think the possibility of reshaping an algorithm could start with the needs of the child. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Joy. We actually already have a question ready to, we have someone ready to ask a question already. So we're just going to get things going very quickly. So I'm just going to unmute you, Samasa, and then you can speak with Joy.
Hello, Dr. James. Thank you for that. I'm a graduate student who's very much so interested in meditating on questions of violence and approaches to violence. And I'd like to know, what would you like to see come from a new generation of people who are trying to think about violence, and in particular, think about violence in a way that does not create a dichotomy between sorts of ontological violence, when you think about like carceral terror or the afterlife of slavery, versus more immediate material violence, especially from the state. And I'm in sociology, so if you could also think about what those conversations have looked like in the social sciences in the past, and what you think, how they could be renewed in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. That's a really tough question, which you already know. So I have to say a little bit about my background in order to answer, because I think that there's a political analytical component to it, and then an emotional intelligence component to it. So I was raised in a military family, right? And so as a child, I was used to violence. Also, my mother was a sharecropper in Mississippi, and she was forced into the fields at age 5, and also saw lynchings. So there's ways in which both by like the person who paid for my braces, right? And the person who just raised me on a daily basis, and maybe didn't have enough bandwidth to like really address like, you know, what are the possibilities of agency, of free thinking. A lot of it was just stay in line, follow the rules, keep your head down. And this is when I probably started thinking about the captive maternal, like as a stabilizer of structure. And I remember cocktail parties, because my father was an officer, so we had a class duality in the family that didn't, you know, wasn't good for anybody. But anyway, so Black officers would come, they would play like John Coltrane, they were all decked out because they had resources, but they were also fighting in Vietnam, right? They knew how to survive fragging, and fragging is when you pull the pin out of the grenade and you throw it towards the officer corps of the US, because, you know, you sort of did the logic like, this war is stupid, whether or not you call it genocidal, but why is it like Black people are on the forefront catching all the flack and dying disproportionately for an empire that we, you know, if we go back home, you know, we can be beaten and in prison. So I think the contradictions necessitated a stability and also kind of blinders. So the question you put on the table, you place on the table is like, okay, take the blinders off and see what the possibilities are. I'm not sure. Okay, so I don't know. I already told you that, right? I find that the possibilities increase if you have a spiritual practice. So at one point I went to seminary, and then I started straight, and then I went back into church, even though it's patriarchal and sexist and homophobic and everything else, right? But it's like doing virtual church with the Black church in Harlem kind of reminds me of the millennia of struggle. I mean, just the time span of it. And it's not going to happen in this moment. the way that we would like it to come down, and it never stops without suffering. And so I rely more on that than when I hear that same discourse in what I'll call a secular religion that kind of promises you, like, if you just stay within the algorithm, there will be change. I mean, but sort of minimizes suffering, right? The inevitability of suffering. I also, because I grew up in a military family and I was in ROTC and I'm trained by Jesuits. So like there's an aspect of me that, you know, is not a good profile for a radical, but it was helpful in terms of allowing me to think like maybe 360. I've also like shot weapons. I was trained to shoot weapons, right? And so when I talk to some sisters I know, and I look at the stats that Black women are one of the fastest demographics for purchasing guns, right? I can't immediately dismiss that. It's, you know, my understanding, it's a sense of precarity when I talk to friends in Texas and they, you know, tell me it's Black women across the board, it's LGBTQ, it's like little, you know, small business owners. It speaks to the sense of vulnerability, but also their own agency. What I will say is I'm uneasy about individual strategies for safety and security, that I believe in collective caretaking that should be democratized, right? That people will end up caring for elders who are dying, for people who are differently abled, for children, that needs to be democratized more, even though captive maternals are ungendered, but disproportionately that labor is done as low pay or no pay by people who identify as female, right? But we need to democratize caretaking, and we also need to democratize violence. Like, yeah, defund the police, but actually you can try. We saw it in New York City, and they just moved money around from a $6 billion budget. And the police have like picked up the van thing out of Portland, like just grabbing a young woman off the street in an unmarked van and then letting her go with the ticket because what she did was graffiti and put out some surveillance cameras. But I know two young Black men from New York City who were hospitalized by the NYPD when they were doing peaceful protests. So what does democratized violence look like? I do not know, but I think it should be on the algorithm, right? I think that some way of community self-defense and individual self-defense needs to be discussed as best as we can in whatever sectors. Because like in New York City, if we have 69 shootings on July 4th, you end up with a community. And where I live in Manhattan, right, you know, because I'm a prof, I'm like in between two sectors, but you know, I'm in between enough of affluent, you know, the multi-million-dollar building next door and NYCHA on the other side of the block, right? So the police like are a little careful and they want to check you out before they mess you up. Like, do you belong to the multi-million-dollar building, which I don't? Do you belong to NYCHA, which I don't, but I'm in the middle. But people who are in the middle feel that civilian violence is as disruptive as cop violence. And so however we refigure our algorithms, they're going to have to understand that violence is not just horizontal, that we need more therapeutic intervention. And social workers are also cops, if anybody knows about how child removal works. But we also need to talk about vertical violence, like violence from police forces and horizontal violence at the same time. And those discussions I haven't heard. And I have no answers to them, but I would love to participate more in those kinds of discussions. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Amasa. We do have just like one point of kind of clarification on the statistic. Someone's asked when, from when has the suicide rate gone up by 93%?
Okay, I don't have the number or the documentation on that, but I saw that within the last 6 months to a year, but I can find it or they can Google. The numbers might be off, but what my understanding when I first spoke about that, which was months ago, probably a year ago at Brown, it was part of it was anecdotal. Like when we were growing up, we said Black kids never damaged themselves. You know, that was like a white phenomenon, like whites on opiates. And other people have talked about this, the high rate of white suicides from alcoholism, driving their cars into trees, from being addicted to opiates and overdosing, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was this sort of pride in our resilience. And then I read about the numbers, and they were spiking. And part of the data included not just completed suicides, but ones that were not completed, and talked about children being left impaired because they jumped off some high platform or they attempted to hang themselves. And so then their level of care following such attempts became more intense, but in families that did not have the resources to continue with that care. So if the number is off, I apologize, but I think the data is reliable, that there's been a spike. One other thing I would note to that is there has been documentation about the rise of Black infant mortality and Black maternal mortality. And in a recent study that I believe was by Harvard researchers, what they found was that in a neighborhood where an unarmed Black person was shot and killed, the stress levels of pregnant women shot up. If the person had a weapon or a gun, the levels did not spike as they did if it was an unarmed Black person, right? And so I was reading that as a kind of sense of collective suffering. And also you could think of as in lynching. I mean, lynching parties didn't just locate or specify just on one person. They could expand to a whole community. And it's a sense of, you know, the irrationality of policing, that it could be anybody shot, is what created more stressors for Black pregnant women, right? And if you like later, I'll find the documentation that I was using for those talks, and I can send them to you to share.
Well, that'd be wonderful. Thanks. Thank you, Joy. We do have kind of an open stack, but I've got a question here from Joseph Diaz, who asks, is anti-white violence always, already, and only miraculous, magical, unthinkable, and prophetic?
I'm not sure, what does he mean by, or she, what do they, sorry, mean by anti-white violence?
I will try and, perhaps they can kind of send me something in the chat. I can also kind of unmute them if they...
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason I use Fred there's a reason why I go to Fred. In terms of the Rainbow Coalition, he was talking about white Appalachians, Puerto Ricans. I mean, it's a working class who's also overly policed. So I don't know what...
I've got, Joseph's asked, Joseph says he can be kind of unmuted, so we'll do that instead.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, Joseph.
Oh, hi, Professor James. I'm just speaking to whiteness in terms of kind of the political theological myth that whiteness is. I don't take whiteness seriously as an ethnic identification. I always think of whiteness as a political, institutional marker of one's seat of authority. So every other ethnic or racial marker seems to indicate some kind of presence of corruption or fall from whiteness. So I think of them as pink people. But when we're talking about whiteness, right, I think of the seat of political authority. So when we're talking about a kind of anti-racist violence outside of the algorithm of liberal hegemony, I'm just, reminded of conversations of the Haitian Revolution being unthinkable, being unwritable. In some sense, we're kind of moving outside of discourse here. And I think you spoke to it when you were starting to speak to the spiritual resources that you need to call on to continue to do this kind of work. And I'm just thinking, is this kind of, the kind of violence that has been classified by the FBI as the violence of Black identity extremists, the
Right.
violence that specifically targets those who are unthinkable to target.
Right.
That's what I would kind of mean by an anti-white violence, and it are some of the frameworks to talk about that, frameworks of the miraculous, the prophetic, or something of that sense.
Okay, thank you for that. I will try to address that, right? So just my background, I'm a political theorist, so that probably means nothing. But anyway, the way that I think it's a political science has its own limitations, right? So Joseph, when you're talking, like, two concrete things came to mind. Like, one is a text, Cheryl Harris's Whiteness as Property, right? So I think, and when I was in seminary, I was working with Cornel West, right? So he would talk about existential whiteness, right? And the way in which it's accumulated and it can be used, right? It's purchasing power in society, but not just in US society, but throughout the globe, throughout the world. But also, to go back to West, right? So he was in Charlottesville, and he said on multiple public platforms that Antifa saved his life. Unfortunately, you know, Heather Heyer, as a white woman, anti-racist in a march, died, right, from a neo-Nazi who's now doing life in prison. And we could talk about restorative justice if you want to, like whether or not that sentencing is fair or not. I have no answers to that either. But so, where I get my inspiration is largely from Black militant formations or Black cultural or Black spiritual, but it doesn't preclude any coalition with anybody other than maybe hegemons, right? So to the extent that I am a hegemon myself, I'm sure like people cross the street, but I have like, I'm allergic to hegemony as well, right? So it gets a little messed up. Like, you know, I'm employed like basically in a multi-billion corporation that's called a college, and that comes with certain kind of parameters. I don't live in Massachusetts, I live in a city, more than one city, but New York City for a reason, so that I can interact with people who have worldviews that are much more complicated. So I talked about the churches I went to, like there's two. So one is led by a white female pastor. In fact, it's all female led. It has a Black trans altar, which is, it's an old church. So they're white alabaster angels, but then there are photographs of all the Black women who've been murdered as a cross, right? Because the church also has probably the only, as far as I know, teen shelter, trans teen shelter in New York City. And disproportionately it's Black teens, right? And it has a very open, like stay as long as you want. I mean, I think you could stay as long as 18 months. It has a communal kitchen. They don't have to go to church. It's not indoctrination. You don't have to come upstairs, right? Or anything like that. I also had heard that the city was sending letters out to churches, and I cannot verify this, so I'm just sharing what I've heard from people who are connected to the clergy to try to close some of these sanctuaries, right? Which would force people who are unhoused into state custodial care. Because in the midst of COVID, they were forcing people who were unhoused out of the subways when they were living in subways or staying in the subway cars. It seems like they were trying to get them out of churches. They sort of just wanted to be able to register them in these official locations that were not hospitable, or people would have been going to them anyway. So then the second church is also multiracial, but it's led by Black pastors, male and female. I end up going to alternating between the two because in order to have both my politics and my need to have spiritual grounding, neither one of them is sufficient. So I don't preclude any kind of coalition formation. That's why I use Fred, right? Because Fred was totally brilliant. And that Rainbow Coalition was used by Jesse Jackson, and then it got picked up by Obama. That whole rainbow was in his, you know, campaign and stuff. I think undoing whiteness is white people's issue, so I will never be on an educational about what they need to do or how I can help them undo it. I'm not really interested in that whatsoever. But I have met radical revolutionary people both in the States and in other countries, and it wasn't always predicated on their ethnic formation. And I've also met reactionary people of various ethnicities, both in this country and in other sites. So that's about as best as I can answer your query, Joseph.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Joy. We've got about three questions on the stack. So I don't know. We'll kind of see how long that goes, but we might have to kind of close it relatively shortly. So please do kind of get your, if you do have a question or you want to ask Joy one yourself, please do send me a message in the chat. But we have Margarita next up on stack.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Dr. James. I emailed you a few months ago. Thank you for responding, first of all.
How you doing?
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you for talking with the COLA movement, because I think you validated a lot of the things that at least we've individually tried to do by saying like so as somebody that lost a student like that passed away, my first thing is to say, so do you know anybody that died? And if you can't answer that question, don't talk to me, right? So in those situations, when you have folks that are trying to say like, well, this is what we should do, or this is the algorithm that we should take up, or this is how we're supposed to play with people's lives, I'm like, look, I don't know where y'all from. And I'm like, I'm from Houston. We don't play with folks, right? Like, this is somebody's child, and I don't play with somebody's children, right? As an educator. So I just want to say that primarily, but then also to very much remind folks, right? When you get to the questions in which you feel comfortable saying like, well, whose life is more valuable than somebody else's? You're stepping in a realm that is not okay, right? Like that's never should be on the table. Because like, who made you judge and jury to say like, oh yeah, it's okay for somebody to die, right? Like if you're thinking with that extent, like that means you're in a different algorithm that shouldn't even be part of the equation, right? So that was my response question. Food for thought. I don't know. It's something.
No, thank you, Marguerite. I mean, that really helps. I mean, it sort of grounds us into what we're facing. I mean, essentially we're facing death, and most often, like, people don't want to acknowledge that because they have different coping skills. But, you know, like, so in the city, again, you know, in terms of disproportionality, whatever you want to call it, it was Latinx and it was Black people. I mean, because they were, quote, the essential workers. And I started thinking, you know, you're talking about the expendable essential workers, right? I mean, you're keeping the city going, but also these are the people who end up caring for other people, raising other people's children, taking care of other people's elder. I mean, people who have the disposable incomes to, quote, hire them, but at these wages that don't allow sufficiency or even health. And then there are the public hospitals in New York City where nobody wanted to go because they were substandard and people were using garbage bags as PPEs or reusing their masks and writing their names on them, hanging them on a hook. And then there were the private hospitals that didn't have the kind of casualties or loss of life. It's the same with the so-called nursing homes. Like if you're working class or of modest means, like where your parents went would be a place that would spike in terms of deaths related to insufficient care. And if you were wealthy enough to bring them to your second, third home, whatever it is you have, you were likely to have a different outcome or to have really private care in these like gated communities. You know, AOC sent out a tweet a couple of weeks ago that there are 118, so that stat I do know, where I got it from. There are 118 billionaires in New York City, but Governor Cuomo won't they're not going to tax them. And so everything is at a deficit. I mean, there were food lines. There still are food lines in the city, right? So so I have people I care about who are in prison, right? And participating in some of these endeavors, which are about letter writing and saying the right thing, and then you can't say COINTELPRO, and I rewrite the letter 4 times. Like, why can't I say COINTELPRO? Oh, because it pisses the cops off. And I was like, when did we ever care? It was like, yeah. So like, be nice to them, and the prosecutors don't like it. And then I watched this hearing, and some will leave their nameless. And I just saw how the very discourse was punitive, and it's not even about forgiving. That's what I mean about the horizontal restorative justice. I mean, it doesn't really work in a war scenario. Like, it works for domestic violence. It works for what happens on the community block. It doesn't work in terms of the disposability of whole populations and whole communities, right? So like, I'm listening to this hearing, and I can tell the outcome, it's going to be negative. And the point was that a Superior Court justice had ordered my friend released, and the Attorney General was the first Black woman Attorney General in New York, and that's why I don't trust these label things, right? Had sent her SG to argue against it, and they prevailed. But what they did in prevailing, this person was supposed to be released so they didn't get COVID. So they blocked their release. They got COVID. Fortunately, they're still alive, but they lost capacity in one lung. They're in their 60s. But what they did is set the precedent for not releasing large numbers of people in New York State prisons. And at the time, there were over 40,000, and they'd only released a couple of hundred. They were making incarcerated people make New York Clean, which is a hand sanitizer that the state sold to create revenue to people outside, but didn't give sufficient soap, right, and warm running water or hand sanitizer to people inside. So it reaches this moment, and I'm not saying, Marguerite, that you were speaking to it, but I'm speaking to it. It reaches this moment where you have to, at least for me, I have to process my rage along with my analysis, right? So I'm trying to be mindful about when I speak, where I speak, how much time I take up speaking. And I'm also trying to be mindful that I'm a middle-class prof, and so white collar worker, so I don't have to go out, even though I rarely go out. But we coexist with people we care about who could die the next day or who died yesterday. And it's this inability to restore community in the face of a predatory state called a democracy, which clearly is pushing us to look for other alternatives to the norm.
Okay, thank you, Joy. We've got a question from MJ, so I'm just going to unmute them.
Oh, hey, Joy.
Hey.
Good to see you again. I think I ask the same question every time I hear you speak, which is I'm really glad that you're just talking about it as war in the last article that you shared. And I'm just like, with all the political theorists and all of the people who are specialists on fascism and the rest of it, like, enough people are saying this is where the US is at. And I guess it's not, so I feel paralyzed, but also like, who's actually, as people understand it theoretically, is there anybody who is prepared to fight it, or is everybody just actually waiting for whatever happens with this election and, the political violence that will ensue in either direction and the people who will go to prison or be killed or whatever else? Like, are people just waiting for all of that to play out to see if they survive it? Or is there anybody who's actually ready to resist it? Those of us who understand that this is the context we're in, are we I mean, I'm just sitting here in Canada hoping it doesn't affect us too badly. But beyond that, I don't know. You know, what do we do with this?
Yeah.
Those of us who get it, and is there anybody who's actually prepared to fight it, aside from some of the politicians who will probably be the first to be killed or put in prison or whatever else may happen to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, at first it's good to see you again. It's been a while, right? And I remember when you pushed me when I was giving that talk, you know, when you're talking about internationally, right? Like, tell me what war looks like, you know, Rwanda and other places. And so, yeah, I think people are hedging their bets. I mean, I think this is why I was struck by what I'm calling the algorithm of anti-racism. I think that's a hedge. It's a huge hedge. Like, you know, well, if Biden gets elected, then we can keep working with this algorithm, right? Because it got us to a better place. And I'm not opposed, I'm not saying don't vote. You know, I voted for Obama. I supported Bernie since 2015. I never thought our possibilities were all that great, but just thought this is another, you know, tool in the toolbox, and just keep using what's available until the tools run out, right? I've said before, maybe I was saying this when I was with you guys, it was a Toronto or Montreal? It was Montreal, right? Yeah. Yeah. We've gotten used to incremental dying among Black people. Like, as long as we die in manageable numbers, even if it's a spectacle, right? Then it becomes a call to moral outrage and some kind of intervention, but the numbers are still manageable. Yeah. Like, you know, at what point is it like, I'm sorry, there was just one death too many? And so now it's just full blown. And I don't even know what full blown looks like. I'm struck by the way we love each other and care for each other. I mean, I'm struck, you know, about, like, when I talk about the maternals, like that Mimi Till Mobley had an open casket funeral for a 14-year-old who was mutilated and tortured and murdered, right? And 10,000 people reportedly came. And then Rosa Parks says that's why she didn't give up her seat. Or when I went to Chicago in November for the refounding of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression last year. And like, so Angela was doing the keynote, right? And which is fine, it was all positive and like move forward. But then I go into sidebar, and then there's like a mother, and you know, there's a link to her in that article who talks about her 21-year-old son hanging in the tree in her backyard when she goes out to let the dog out, right? And that she was the activist in Ferguson. He just wanted to be a licensed real estate. So he was studying for his real estate exam, but she had been the, you know, activist, and then, you know, hugging her, saying, is there anything I can do? And like, there's nothing I can do because you can't resurrect a dead child, right? But listening to the story, her not being able to finish, her husband picking up the story, you know, and it's not just the death, the murder, her saying they're like cars out front, white men, surveillance, didn't know if it police, vigilantes, whatever. But, you know, her son's pants are rolled down to his ankles. The sheet around his neck is not from her linen set in her house. It's a Navy knot. He wasn't even in the Boy Scouts. The chairs on the other side of the tree. And it's just sort of like, okay, to punish the mother, you murder the child, right? But that doesn't have the predictable outcome, right? And so I sort of ended this brief reading or rambling, whatever you want to call it, talking about children, like murder the child and see what happens. Because it's not always that, you know, people accept that punishment. I mean, some people absorb it, and then that trauma becomes a catalyst to like, well, let's just take on the entire country, you know, if not the world. Mm-hmm. And I think between COVID, between the loss of employment, between growing hunger, growing homelessness, something between the antagonism of the state, like you can air quote stormtroopers if you want or not, coming from the Attorney General, these unidentified federal police forces. Yeah, it's volatile, and things will continue to mutate, and they will continue to explode. the issue will be what we're prepared for and what we can organically continue to prepare ourselves for as the very ground we stand on continuously shifts. Mm-hmm. And so there's no way getting out of this without more suffering. And there are some people who are like, I don't plan to suffer. And this is so horrible. I'm so sad. You know, I can write a check. And I've been writing checks too. But I think increasingly for a number of us, like we're just accepting like, yeah, this is going to be massive trauma and checks don't matter that much anymore. And the algorithm doesn't work. And so we will reinvent the world with laws. But, you know, the only way I end is with the children, but we reinvent it for the children. And that becomes like this great mobilizer. This is weird, you know, but I'll just say it because I know you and I'm looking at you, I can say it. I think there's a kind of beauty in it and there's something very divine. And I don't think those things can register in an algorithm. Yeah. I don't know how people who can't feed their kids keep getting up to try to feed them and hustle for them. I don't know how people who lose their children to the state keep, you know, trying to get them back. I don't know how people who think they're going to get COVID and know they have loved ones who can get COVID still demand that the prisons open in New York State so they can see their loved ones. They've curtailed it to 2 hours a day. People are like, I have to travel 15 hours round trip, and now you give me 2 hours a day to see my loved one. I don't know how grandparents, mostly grandmothers, who have their daughters inside are raising their grandkids. And like, pretty sure I'm probably gonna get COVID from these babies, but they're mine. So we do it anyway. It's just something really horrible and beautiful at the same time. Yeah. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you for that.
Thank you, MJ, and thank you, Joy. We've got about 4 more questions left. Is that okay, Joy? I think if we go beyond that, we might be here for some time. So it might be good. So I think that's probably, but we'll see how things go. So the next one is from Tony. So I'm gonna unmute Tony.
Thank you so much for this, Dr. James. I wanted to ask, you were talking about doing work that doesn't feel depleting because it's not structured by the academy. I just specifically wanted to know what the work is that does feel depleting because it is structured by the academy. Obviously, I'm a grad student at Santa Cruz. I've been organizing with the Cola Movement this year. You know, we're fighting the boss, but there's a way in which that struggle is in a way structured by the academy because we're all grad students. You know, the people who organized this talk are grads at Irvine. That's kind of basically the question, just like what the work is that you were referencing there.
The work outside the academy or the work inside the academy?
Inside the academy that feels depleting.
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. I like working with young people, like the classroom. I don't mind that. And I know when I first had my academic gig with UMass Amherst and I was in women's studies, and like people were complaining and I was teaching the memoirs. People always complain, I complain. But anyway, I was teaching the memoirs of Assata Shakur, Angela Davis, and so forth. And it was a bit of a shock. This is decades ago in the 90s, right? So it was a bit of a shock to the predominantly white women's studies crew. And then I just said, okay, I'll give you all A's if you just stop complaining and we can just talk about political struggle. And then I kind of knew what might happen, but I watched. So some people just took their A's and they never came back. Some people took their A's and they stayed and struggled. And then later they talked about how going back to their white families, like for holidays, was just like, they felt orphaned, right? Because they saw the world in a different way and they were becoming dedicated to anti-racist struggle, but now they were going to be rendered as undesirable within their own clan. And I would listen to that and I would try to empathize, but obviously that that wasn't like my focus, right? But I understood, you know, that their suffering was real, and they had made a political choice. There are other ways, right? Like I mentioned in the article, airbrushing revolution, like at University of Colorado Boulder, did not appreciate organizing in the academy, right? I mean, because it had a mandate that in part was performative, right? And also it had an understanding of economies. Like if we're paying for this, we get what we buy, which was, you know, and since I wasn't paying for it, you know, I'm not paying for airfare, I'm not paying for honoraria, I'm not paying for hotels, I'm not paying for the dinners, then there's limited say about, well, what is accountability to working class people? What is accountability to the incarcerated? I remember a number of years ago at Princeton at a large conference being asked to speak on Assata Shakur, which I never minded because I, you know, used to travel, and totally amazing person, quite brilliant. And if there was anything I could do, and obviously not able to travel anymore, right? Not just because of COVID, but also because of bounty. But if there was anything I could do, I would do it. But like from the platform, like on stage, I could see one reality, which is the auditorium, which is also weird because like it looked like New Jersey troopers came in at the same time as giving my talk. So that was just a weird little, you know, blip. But a Black woman who was sitting near the front row stood up and said in Q&A, I come from a vocational school, like a 2-year college, and the people you're talking about are my students. They're the ones who go to prison. And everybody on this panel is from an Ivy League school. So why is it the people who teach the people and care for them, it's not just textbook teaching, but listen to them talk about their families, their need of job security, their struggles in their lives, right? Those are our kids, those are our students. We're never on these platforms. And the person was basically chastised by a very prominent person who said, well, look at this student over here. It was their idea and it's their conference. So you shifted the burden onto the student themselves, not onto the academics. And you're blaming, this was their dream to do this. And I just said, well, yeah, it's true across the country. I mean, the people who are dominating the discourse are either at Research Ones or they're at private Ivies because the platform is engineered for that. Like, and honestly, I don't think I've ever been to a conference and shared a panel with somebody who taught at a 2-year college. And that obviously is a problem. But so the thing that happened from Boulder, like, so my introduction to abolitionism came from Davis. And of course I said I met Davis before I became an academic. But what happened after Boulder is I did an anthology and I convinced Palgrave Macmillan to mail 50 copies inside to prisons. And I couldn't have done that except for as an academic. So I appreciate that. But it was an anthology of the conference. And when I mailed it in to someone who'd been in the Panthers and also in the underground, they wrote a short note saying, thank you for the anthology. It really doesn't reflect our lives, you know, of people who've been in, at that time, they'd been in for over 20 years. Now they're doing their 49th, right? And that like sobered me up because I was like self-congratulatory. Oh my God, we did this conference and the undergrads were great, exhausted, pissed off, but still we did it. And now we did a book from all the papers. And then you send it to people who live those conditions and they're like, you kind of missed the mark. And so when I went to Brown, I spent 6 to 8 years mostly organizing with undergrads, only anthologizing political prisoners and rebels. And so try to give the undergrads, like if you look at the books, like in Prison Intellectuals, they write the bios, their names are there. We tried to theorize collectively. They helped organize the conference. That's where I first met Dylan Rodriguez and Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton. They were doctoral students. Like I got to take the money, my research funds that Brown recruited me with, and use that money. So that's the one time I controlled money and fly in people. And also got to see like the disciplinary pushback from the university when they, at the same time, or when they figured out what the conference was about, because I invited like Weather Underground, like people, you know, bombed the Pentagon, nobody got hurt, but they still did it. You know, people who've been in underground, from the Panthers to the Republic of New Africa, but they organized a mandatory meeting for everybody on financial aid at the same time our conference started. And so it was really cool to see what the students did. So they went in, because if you didn't show up, it would kind of jeopardize your financial assistance. So they went in and they signed in, or they got other people to, and then by 2 or 3, they just sort of disappeared out of that mandatory meeting and showed up at the conference. And other ways that I've seen organizing from the students, which has amazed me, was it was a son who was a president of one of the countries in Latin America. I know there are many, but it's like people's privacy. But anyway, they had organized, it appears to be a little wing that was homophobic and transphobic against the students who were more working class, like were on the scholarship. And so I was talking to some of them, and I stayed in touch with some of them still, like to this day, because this is years ago. They organized a die-in where, you know, like you have the police chalk lines around the bodies. So they did it just when the trustees were coming. I call the trustees the bank, right? Because they raise the money and they decide the disbursement. So the trustees had to step over their bodies to get into the administration building. And what they were saying is, we're done with the transphobic, homophobic violence on this campus that the police won't deal with. And so they did this performative act. But later they told me, and then I'm just saying they told me, you know, so nobody tries to sue me for anything. But they told me that they heard from administrators at the school who said, we control your psychological profiles, like when you come for therapy, and we're happy to let your parents know that you're trans, or that you're, you know, like things that they hadn't shared with their families, and some of them had been kicked out by their families anyway. We own your mental profile based on the quote free therapy that we've been giving you over these years. And if you don't stop doing this, we are happy to release those profiles to your you know, you're in whoever's parental care. And so I appreciate the fact that I've learned a lot about how corporations operate from being an academic. And when I was on the outside as a grad student, I didn't quite get it. But I have a better understanding how money reaches, right? And how it functions. And last thing I would say, the Black women activists at Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn, who's named after an assassinated civil rights leader, right? They're the ones who taught me how to analyze race. So when I had a postdoc and I was at UC Santa Cruz and I was in Professor Davis's seminar on Foucault, I immediately could pick up what was wrong with Foucault and kind of raise those queries that later Davis picked up and built on, as well as others. And so it's the intellectuals who may be tied to the academy but are not structured by it are the ones that are like brilliantly offline, but actually have the content of what it means to be in struggle.
Okay, so we have 3 more questions, and then that's going to be kind of us for today. So the next one is from Heather, so I'll just kind of unmute you now.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm trying to condense this. I really appreciate your sharing about your spiritual aspect to your perspective. I have a spiritual background as well, and that it kind of correlates to me with seeing the power structures and how corrupted they get, but also having the understanding of the kind of possibilities within those spiritual ideas or philosophies or what have you, and see how they get corrupted. It gives you a different perspective of, it's kind of like being the professor within the system, but being a little offline of it, if that makes any sense. And so understanding a little bit about like church history and how interpretations of texts and things have come over time, and how, the Enlightenment has kind of divorced the mental or intellectual from the body and the communal. I've been thinking a lot about algorithmic processes and how that tends to distill a really complicated, complex mass of individuals into kind of groupings on chosen data points, and then tries to predict outcomes based on this distillation or homogeneity of this group is this and this and this and this, and we line up all these data points. And I'm just curious if what you're suggesting is that algorithmic thinking either isn't complex enough yet, or is just not the best methodology to go about looking at these problems, and wonder if potentially looking at these problems, which are sociological and communal in nature, from a more relational lens, maybe through things like attachment theories that are being explored now, or traumatic therapies and that kind of thing, would maybe, if able to be formulated in a more grand perspective, could be a better entry point into discussing these problems in a more complex nature.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, so I'm going to try to address that. I might be a bit off mark. So I think revolutionary struggle is different from an algorithm, right? And so I think first we have to decide what we're dealing with, and if this is actually a war, right? And I make the argument that it is. I mean, I use, General Clausewitz, right, 19th century treatise or whatever. You could use a lot of different things, but it's basically, if we look at how we live, and we who are living under these conditions of white supremacy and racial terror and disposability, so we see how we live. If you have wealth, it can mitigate harm. Usually you're just embedded in white wealthy communities, so that's kind of your buffer zone, right? It's like Derek Bell, like in his argument, if you belong to an influential white person, you've got some cover, right? And including if you're an entertainer and they love your music or love whatever, like love that last book you wrote, then you've got some kind of protective shield. For the majority, that's not how we function or live, right? So I would say, to the extent an algorithm is useful, use it. It's just another tool. Don't rely on it for liberation, because that's what I was trying to say. Like, if you trace it back to the 18th century abolitionists, it's not designed for liberation. I think it's mostly designed for, managing certain levels of terror, intimidation, exploitation, disposability, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, the therapeutic is important, but then here you're caught in a conundrum, right? I use that when I was talking about the Sammy Davis Jr. conundrum, right? That you could perform for the defense committee of a very valued politicized person who risked a lot, meaning Davis, and you could perform at a rally for the re-election of Richard Nixon, who was, encouraging the COINTELPRO to pursue its hit list, and also turning the war on drugs into an anti-insurrectionist war against anti-war protesters, meaning white youth, students, right? And Black radicals and Native Americans and we could go on and on and on. So if we're dependent on the algorithm as a recipe for freedom, then I believe you've already agreed that you don't want freedom. Right? I mean, you could get brownies and you can get kombucha, right? From algorithms, but you're not going to get freedom from algorithms, right? So even if you see how influential people design them, this is why I talked about the color change taking on Facebook, but we could talk about Amazon's algorithm about hiring talented people, which had a gender bias, and then they had to drop it, or the surveillance, the facial surveillance mechanism that finally people said, you guys need to put that down, because the racist bias embedded in it was just extending the forms of policing. So we have not controlled violence. And we don't have an algorithm that will have a confrontation with violence. It's not a dominant algorithm. People are designing, engineering their own stuff on the side. So I would, my position is I look at everything. I understand the importance of spirituality, but I also understand the limitations of goodness in a war. So if you have kids or if you have loved ones and you plan for them to survive, you may not reach that high mark of spiritual goodness. And I'm totally fine with that as long as my kin survives. And so those are calculations under duress. And I think people who design stuff that gets platformed may not be living under the same levels of stress and duress. But like I said, I have no answers. I just have me and my crew. We do what we can as best we can. And we try to understand the value of ethics and healing. But you also know that if you're constantly being threatened with terror and trauma, the best of you may be that part of you that demands survival, as opposed to being nice on an algorithm.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy. We have two more questions left, and this one's from Janine.
Hey, Janine. And there's probably more than one Janine in the world, but
oh, it's this one. Okay, you can't see me, but you know what?
Yeah, girl. How you doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
Well, thanks.
I understood just now what you said about algorithm, and you don't think you get freedom from it. So, but I still want to ask you a little bit about this algorithm. Like you, I'm going to talk about it in terms of a recipe. And sometimes actually when you're looking up algorithm and getting dictionary definitions, sometimes they will explain it in terms of a recipe. So what I was thinking about or wondering about was this. Okay, so a recipe is not, well, in some sense you might want to think of it as the ingredients that you use to make something, but in order to convey that, you need words, okay? So suppose you didn't know what boudin was. Boudin is actually a stuffed sausage dish, but suppose you'd been running around with a bunch of little kids who'd been saying caca boudin, and you knew what that was. Caca boudin, that's what they're pointing when they're looking at dog shit on the ground or when they're looking at shit. And so someone proposes to you boudin, but where you've heard that is always with caca boudin. And so you need to change, someone would need to change the word and say, no, stuffed sausage. That's all that I mean, stuffed sausage, not boudin. And so then you might go along with it. So I wanted to know, going back to Black Lives Matter, going over to Black Liberation Movement, as you said, if you move to Black Liberation Movement, there would be a realignment. Okay, and so I wanted to ask, if you went from caca boudin to sausage, there wouldn't be a realignment. You would just say, okay, let's not call it that. Let's eat it. I'll still eat this. I'll eat whatever it is. But here, what I think you're suggesting is that, or you might be suggesting, is that it's not just the words, like in caca boudin, the association with the words, the symbolic association, but the fact that many people, even at the moment, who appear to be with Black Lives Matter, may not be if the words were changed. And in that sense, they may not actually be for Black liberation or Black freedom, which would mean that Black Lives Matter for them means God knows what. But it doesn't mean Black liberation or Black freedom, because once you get that, they're out of it. They're not going to eat the sausage. And so I wanted to know, so those who would have to be realigned, is it that they would say, no, we're for Black freedom, but it has to be severely curtailed, and if severely curtailed, how? And it would have to be curtailed with their input. And in fact, perhaps with them leading the way, at least in the sense that it has to pass their green light, or they're not behind it. So I just wanted to, I don't know if I was clear, but that's what I'm asking about. going from BLM to Black Liberation Movement isn't just a matter of the symbol of the thing and not liking the symbol, but something gets realigned because Black Lives Matter to people in some sense does not really mean Black freedom or Black liberation, which is a concept whose reality would absolutely push away many people who seem like supporters. So I just wanted to know what you might have to think about.
Yeah, thanks for that, Janine. So I'm going to try and then we'll talk more later, okay? I agree with you that it's not just a shift in terminology, right? That there is something troubling about Black liberation, about Black freedom. And the interesting thing, like just to go back, and again, war is not a metaphor, right? But go back to the scenario, the analysis of war. I mean, Black freedom, Black liberation presupposes that the war is over and that Black people won, right? So it doesn't mean that there's going to be white bondage or other people in bondage, just like, yo, it's done. And however, we got to this moment that we're free from these reinventions of slavery, including convict prison lease system, where belonging to state and northern corporations that came south to rebuild the South, right? We died on faster rates than we had on plantation because we're no longer private property, we were public property, right? And we could go through COINTELPRO, you know, Fred was drugged and he was probably going to be brain damaged no matter what, but you shoot him in the head in his bed. Yeah, I mean, this is what happens when you don't have Black liberation. So what happens when you do have Black liberation? That means that something went down, something happened, some struggle evolved and was resolved so that we're not replaying this script every day, every generation, or every other movement cycle, right? And I would argue that it's easier to be for people's lives mattering than it is to be for people having freedom and everything that would have to change with the economy, with policing, with imperialism. Like 40% of the people held in those pens by Homeland Security or whatever, ICE, right? They're Haitian. And if we could talk about, someone brought up, was it Joseph, the Haitian Revolution? It's like, we thought we resolved it. It's like, over 200,000 Haitians, I believe, died, just trying to get free of France. And then they had to pay a debt to France to reimburse their slave owners, which includes their rapists and their torturers, for their loss of so-called property, which was themselves and their kids, right? So you kind of win a war, but you didn't get freedom. And so the liberation didn't materialize, but debt did. And then the US invades later and so on and so forth. So I would say, yeah, if you're arguing, or not even arguing, you're analyzing that there is an aversion to Black freedom, I agree to that. And Black freedom would indicate the end of capitalism as we know it, the end of white supremacy, some sort of restoration of indigenous lands where it's not the Bureau of Indian Affairs, like, that's controlling resources, and something to say about judges. If Trump has put in place 200, you can assume they're reactionary, right-wing, or conservative, use any word you want as an adjective, judges, that means that the whole legal order, whoever gets elected president, is going to be skewed towards repression. So yeah, nobody wants a war, but they're fine if a war is waged upon our lives. And if we suffer with certain moments of decorum and certain moments of rebellion, but never to the point of demanding freedom that changes the entire world. You there, Janine? You're gone. Okay.
That's a shame, but I have one question left from Ntombi, and they've asked me to ask it on their behalf. So So Ntombi is a South African student studying in Toronto, and he says that in your, they say in the Architects of Abolitionism talk, you spoke at length about the state and the state as an impediment to our freedom. You mentioned Chris Hani and many other revolutionaries who were assassinated, and also spoke about the state's abilities to turn our desires for freedom into commodities in relation to contemporary abolitionism. Do you think revolutionary struggle is possible in the context of neoliberal capitalism? What can we in the global North learn from political struggles in the global South, which appear to be much more sophisticated and advanced?
Right. So they're saying that the struggles in the global South are more sophisticated?
Yeah, so the last part of the question was, it suggests that the political struggles in the global South are much more sophisticated and advanced than those in the global North. So, and what can we learn from them? I mean, obviously that's if you agree with
Right. That. No, but I agree with that view, right? So I was talking with some Brazilian sisters a couple of weeks ago, right? So because the United States has imperial reach, right? But also incredible marketing. I feel like Madison Fifth Avenue, like we brand the world, and it's usually garbage, from Disney to McDonald's or whatever. But there's a way in which people can look at our movements and mystify them, and then they get exported, like it's templates, like this is what you should follow. And this is why I liked, not that I liked it, but I found it important, I think, including in that talk, the Architects of Abolitionism, which looked at George Jackson as well as Davis, but also Kathleen Cleaver. So this is why that interview that Cleaver did, of all places, on PBS, right? With Henry Louis Gates in '97, where she started talking, and she's one of the few people I've heard put this out in the public arena. She started talking about how you can have these movements, but the Black middle class or the petty bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie, whatever you want to call them, that they were the benefits were gonna skew towards them, right? And that the Panthers, and again, like I talk about the Panthers because, I know I have friends, Ken, whatever. So the Panthers understood themselves to be revolutionaries who learned from international movements, right? And that became what was studied, both in prison and outside of prison. So there was a lot to be learned from the continent. There was a lot to be learned in the Caribbean. There was a lot to be learned from, not just but from Latin America. There is a lot to be learned from the struggle in Vietnam, and like how do you end up with 2 million to 3 million dead Vietnamese to 55,000 dead American soldiers. Like the technology is arrayed against you. So when you fight the empire that has basically the bombing power, can get other nations in line for its imperial conquests or invasions, you're facing the world, right? I would say we would have to have some humility, which I don't think Americans are known for. And we would also have to realize, like, when we've hit our limitations and we're just spinning, like when we're calling things radical and revolutionary that are really not radical or revolutionary. So we're branding our politics to make them seem more transformative than they actually are. And so that's why, the airbrushing piece, part it was a response to something the Maoists wrote, which I just thought, I understood, or thought I understood what they were organizing for, but also that, factual data was not quite correct in their presentation. From Brazil, from that one trip to South Africa, from other places, I've just thought more about 1993, and I'll end at this, right? And it's sort of like I've been talking about algorithms, and it's a play on words, and it's also trying to get a handle on analytical frameworks, right? But in 1993, 3 events happened, right? Toni Morrison won the Nobel Prize in Literature, and that became a big thing in the US as Black success and was highly celebrated. Mandela and de Klerk shared the Nobel Peace Prize, that if you look at it, given what else was happening, you know, around the Afrikaner government, releasing power but not releasing wealth, keeping the land, right? Making sure it's going to be a capitalist endeavor, whatever Mandela was going to have. And the third thing that happened in '93 is Chris Hani was assassinated in his driveway. So Hani, based on my research, and I was at UMass at the time, and the South African students, and I think they were South Asian students whose families were middle class, prominent, whatever, they were socialists, they were radical, they were at UMass. And they asked me to speak at an MLK event and to talk about Hani, who I had never met and did not know. And I tried to work that in with the Martin Luther King, but there was like, people want to hear about Martin Luther King and about the church and about the Black civil rights movement, not really that he had been assassinated too. I was trying to make the link, like, so what happens when you're against capitalism, which King was at the end of his life, you're against imperialism, and the foundations dry up, you know, the Black middle class, upper class won't return your phone calls. So basically, you're isolated because you become increasingly radical. What happens when you're Hani and you're the only person, some would argue, who could outpoll Mandela in an election, meaning that Hani could have been president of South Africa, and then land distribution, right? The redistribution of wealth would have been on the table, not what IMF wanted, but what the people needed, right? So of those three things, like the assassination of Hani, Mandela sharing a peace prize with de Klerk, you know, who was one of the architects of the Afrikaner regime, and Toni Morrison winning a prize for literature, Americans will tend to focus on the literature, right? Because the algorithm directs you there. Because these achievements, right, of individual Black success and wealth are supposed to radiate as possibilities for everybody. They're not possibilities for everybody. What we should focus on is Hani, what he wrote, what he said, how he struggled, and how he died. And, you know, it doesn't have to be Hani. Across the globe, if we understand our desperate need for the intellect and the political will and the spirituality of other people and struggle, then we could pull this off, whatever this is going to be. If we remain isolates and like kind of have that imperial swag, then yeah, we lost before we even tried. So, I mean, thank you all for your questions. I mean, they're going to really help me think more about what I can offer or how I think and the collectives that I work with. And I appreciate your time, and definitely, you know, solidarity to your strikes, get everything you can, and you deserve everything. And also solidarity to the working and the laboring classes as well.
Thank you so much, Joe. We do.